Okay, so now we're looking at the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. We're going to look at misleading information, leading questions, post-event discussion, and anxiety. So there's a few key terms you need to know. So leading questions, misleading information, post-event discussion. These things are named on the specification, so please make sure that you can understand what they are and that you can describe them as well, because you might get a question on that. So we've looked at memory, and now we're kind of looking at memory in real life, so kind of an application of memory. And we're looking at eyewitnesses. So eyewitnesses are people that were there at the time of a crime or an event. And eyewitness testimony is where you are asked in court, usually your recollection of an event. So this is what we're looking at just now. Now, there's a really famous experiment about eyewitness testimony by some psychologists called Loftus and Palmer. So this is their leading questions experiment. So they had 45 students and they were shown 7 short films of traffic accidents. The students were then given questionnaires, and the questionnaires had a set of questions, and in there was one what we call a critical question. And the critical question asked the students how fast the cars were going when the accident happened. And the difference with the critical questions is there was a verb that changed dependent on what condition the students were in. So the independent variable in this experiment is the verb, and the dependent variable is the speed estimate that the students give. So what Loftus and Palmer found was with the 5 different verbs, so you've got hit, bumped, collided, contacted, and smashed, there was a different perception of speed from the eyewitnesses. So if we have a think about what might happen if you get asked a different question. So how fast were the cars going when they hit each other, bumped each other, collided each other, contacted each other, and smashed into each other? So what Loftus and Palmer found was this verb changed the students' perception of the speed of the same instant. So they're watching the same video. The only thing that's different is the verb that's in their sentence. What they found was there was a different average speed estimate for each verb. So when they hit each other, when they bumped, when they collided, when they contacted, when they smashed one another. So the lowest average speed was contacted, and the highest average speed was smashed. What Loftus and Palmer suggested is that verb smashed has connotations with an increased speed. So that group assumed that the car was going faster than it was. So what's happened is these eyewitnesses, these students that have seen the crash, had their memory distorted or changed by misleading or suggestive information. So they had this leading question where you had a verb that insinuated, that suggested that something had gone on, and the students had their memory distorted or changed by this verb. Now, there was a second part to Loftus and Palmer's experiment where they took more students, so 150 students, and showed them a short film with a multi-vehicle car accident. And then again, they were asked questions about the accident, and there were 3 groups this time, not 5 groups. The first group were asked afterwards how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. The second group were asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. And the third group weren't asked anything about the speed, so they acted as a control group. A week later, the students were asked back, and then they were asked another question. Did you see any broken glass? So in the original film that they watched, there was no broken glass. The students were brought back, and they were asked, did you see any broken glass? And what Loftus, the IV is the verb, and the DV is kind of their answer to the question. What Loftus and Palmer found was that more participants in the smash condition reported seeing glass, less participants in the hit and control condition reported seeing glass. Again, suggesting that the verb smashed distorted their memory, and they assumed that in an accident where cars would smash into one another, there would be broken glass, even though there was none there. What this suggests is that there's 2 ways that leading questions can affect our eyewitness testimony, either through response bias all through just kind of altering our memory. So the different speed estimates happened because the verb influenced or biased the response of the students. And what happened was that change of word altered the memory of the students. So they actually remember the accident differently. They actually recall the accident differently. So the memory of that event actually changes in their head. The results showed the way a question is asked can influence an answer given. And Loftus and Palmer suggests that it can change someone's perception of an event, but also your memory of an event can be changed by the information that you receive after that event. And this is called the reconstructive hypothesis. The reconstructive hypothesis is the idea that memory isn't fixed. Once you have a memory, it's not concrete and it won't change. Loftus and Palmer are suggesting that your memory can change. It can be altered after an event and by information that you receive after an event. You can evaluate Loftus and Palmer's study. So the study is an example of leading questions in terms of ecological validity. You've got a lack of anxiety and a lack of emotion in Loftus and Palmer's study. Also, it's not the way that you would find out about information kind of in real life. You can also evaluate the participants, who are all students, so they lack population validity, they're not representative, they're given kind of a biased response perhaps, maybe they haven't had as much experience driving and so on. And you can also evaluate the study in terms of its applications, so police and kind of teachers are good examples of that. The next few slides just kind of go through the study again. It's the same as in your textbooks, so you can go through this in your own time and just look at the study once more. Now, this is Elizabeth Loftus. She was one of the researchers, so Loftus and Palmer. There's a video here where she talks about research, including false memories and something called the bunny effect. So that's for you to look at. And it links to this study on Bugs Bunny in Disneyland. And again, that's something that you can look at. There's some questions that might come up when you're asked about leading questions. So one piece of research, so that would be Loftus and Palmer's research, discuss, so describe and evaluate the validity of the research. Is it correct? What is misleading information? And identify and explain 2 problems that might arise when investigating misleading information. So you might want to practice these questions. These are kind of the short answer questions you might get asked in the exam based on leading questions and the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. When you're talking about validity, remember you can refer to internal and external validity, and there are differences. So internal validity is high in a controlled lab study. External validity in this case is low because it lacks population validity and it has low ecological validity. So remember, when you're asked about validity, you can talk about both internal validity and external validity. There is a real life example on this video and the video on the next slide that look at eyewitness testimony and the accuracy of eyewitness testimony and how eyewitness testimony can be distorted. So that's for you to watch and then have a think. How does this case study show the real life application of this theory and kind of the usefulness of Elizabeth Loftus' work? Okay, so that is leading questions and kind of post-event discussion. So that's the first part of the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. The second part of the accuracy of eyewitness testimony refers to anxiety. Now, look at a picture like this. What do you think happens when you see this? Now, most people will say that you just concentrate on the weapon that's been pointed at you. And that is because you are worried about what's going on. Now, there is a study that looks at the negative effect of anxiety. So what happens when you might be worried and how that might affect your memory. And in Johnson and Scott's study, they had 2 groups of participants who came to take part in a study. And Johnson and Scott are investigating something called weapon focus, or the weapons effect. What they did was participants were in a waiting room and they overheard a conversation between 2 people. In one condition, in the control condition, the man exited a room with greasy hands and a pen. And in the second condition, the participants heard exactly the same conversation. Then they heard a violent argument and then a man came out holding a knife. what they found was if the participants were shown a photo lineup, the control group were able to identify the man 49% of the time, and in the weapon group, they were only able to identify the man 33% of the time. And what Johnson and Scott are suggesting is when we are anxious, so for example, in this situation, when we're paying attention to a weapon, we tend not to remember things quite so well. So the weapon group couldn't remember the face of the man because they were focusing potentially on the knife. You can talk about Johnson and Scott's study in terms of the method. It's a lab study, it's quite controlled, but again, it lacks ecological validity. You can talk about the design, it's independent groups. You might just have different participants with better or worse eyesight, different participants that are paying attention, different amounts in the different groups. And then also, obviously, for this, you can talk about the ethics of this. There's a great risk of protection from harm and people being upset or anxious due to this study. So in terms of your AO3, when you're looking at Johnson and Scott, there's 3 things there that you could use for your evaluation. There is also a positive effect on anxiety. Sometimes it's good to be anxious. We can link this to fight or flight. From biopsychology, when we are in the flight or flight state, when we're in an anxious state, it can increase our alertness and we can pay more attention to what's going on. So our memory can be better when we are anxious. It doesn't necessarily have to be worse. There's a study by Yule Cutzel where participants actually witnessed a real-life incident. They saw a robbery. 13 witnesses were interviewed 5 months later and were asked to rate how stressed they were at the time of the event. What Yule Cutzel found was that their recall was accurate over a long time. And actually, the participants that reported to be more stressed at the time of the incident were actually more accurate in their recall. Now, this is a single event, it's a case study, so we've got loads of problems with generalising from this, but it does suggest that anxiety can increase our memory potentially. There's more notes on this in your textbook if you want to read a bit more. Yule Cutzel's study had high ecological validity because it was a real-life event. However, the people that were more stressed were closer to the event, so potentially they just remembered more because of the distance from the event as opposed to their anxiety levels. Now, this links to something called the Yerkes-Dodson law, excuse me, which is where arousal improves performance up to a point. It's called an inverted U-curve. After the peak, performance will decrease. So, for example, what this is suggesting is if you're doing an exam, you don't want to be too stressed by the exam because your arousal will be too high and your performance will be low. You don't want to be not stressed at all before an exam because your arousal will be low and again your performance will be low. You want to kind of be a bit stressed. So anxiety is a good thing up to a point. That's what the Yerkes-Dodson law is suggesting. There is evidence for this for Bettenbacher, who did a meta-analysis, so like looking at other people's studies of 21 studies, and he found that heightened anxiety made eyewitness memories less accurate, suggesting anxiety can divert attention away for the features of the situation. So you can link this to Johnson and Scott's weapon focus effect. Bacher also then went to review his findings and said that they were too simplistic. He did another meta-analysis and found that eyewitness testimony performance increases gradually up to extremely high levels of anxiety, and then there's a massive drop in performance. So Defenbacher's first meta-analysis supports Johnson Scott's view that anxiety can make our memory worse, and then his second meta-analysis supports the Yerkes-Dodson curve, the Yerkes-Dodson law, that anxiety can increase our memory, can increase our performance up to a point. Now, in terms of memory, in terms of what we looked at so far, there's quite a few things that you can watch on the Simmons kind of media server or on the InnerTube server that will just kind of enhance your knowledge of the topic if you're really interested in memory stuff. There's a few extra things you can watch. I've put a link to some here. There's a Horizon program on how our memory works. There's another program about how to remember everything. So it looks at techniques of people that are trying to remember things. There's a documentary on The Boy That Can't Forget. So he's got a certain type of memory where he struggles to forget things. And then also there's a link to the film Memento. It is a thriller. Please be careful. It is about memory loss.